welcome to the No Hair, All Heart podcast. I am your host, Mookie Spitz, and I'm the one with no hair, but I do have some heart, and the heart that I want to talk about today is my relationship with my parents and how I see myself as a parent through them. This afternoon was sunny here in usually sunny California. I moved from New York City with my 18-year-old son this August. I'm recording this in mid-March. And we've had a lovely 7-8 months in Southern California. I moved back to come back to where he was born. I moved back to get away from the New York weather. I moved back to cut my cost of living. People joke that you move back to California to save money, and I say, yeah. Just about anywhere is less expensive than Manhattan, aside from, say, San Francisco or Hong Kong. But it's been great. It's been a lovely change of pace. It's been a rebooting of our lives. My older son went into the Marines. He's now in specialist training to be an armorer in the U.S. Marines, and that's a story worthy of its own podcast. And my younger son is taking a gap year. When I told a whole room full of high-powered New York City moms at some school event, when they were talking about colleges, that I was thinking of a gap year for my son, much with his own interest and consent, I thought that they would be shocked that I would show my bad dad cards. And it proved to be quite the opposite. They patted me on the back, brought me another brownie and a cup of coffee, and told me that that's the best decision that I could make if there was any ambiguity about his future. Many of them relayed to me that they themselves should have thought of that when they put their older kids into a college without the child really knowing what he or she wanted to do, and without a real sense of purpose or direction. And they also remarked that they have discovered that these gap years for kids are times of reflection and also an opportunity to just take the heat off. We put so much pressure on ourselves and our children, especially these days, with taking a year off to explore, to travel, in my son's case, to get a job, get a few jobs, get his first car, that kind of thing. This intermediary stage between adolescence and young adulthood is best experienced with a little less tension and maybe a path that diverges a little bit from the beaten trail. And that beaten trail has been college, has been going from high school to college, is this American dream of getting that undergraduate degree, checking all the boxes, and then ... living that American dream, which, as we all know, has been, for many, turned upside down, and at the very least, called into question. So here I am in California, in bright and sunny California. There's been, since August, a major fire or two. One was local here. We're in the heart of Orange County. One was not far from us, smoke rising over the palm trees. We didn't have to evacuate. It was a little bit inconvenient. Smoky air, cleared out after a few days. And of course, the major LA wildfires, which just tore through huge sections of the city, costing tens of billions of dollars damage, some fatalities, hell to pay by the residents and soon the government, the insurance companies bellowing up, and just not a very pleasant experience for anyone involved. But that's par for the course, including a couple earthquakes. What would a stay in California, what would a move to California be like without a few earthquakes? So a few jitters, nothing major. And I guess we're all biding our time. The East Coasters used to always joke that California will eventually be an island. That's probably demonstrably true. Who knows when? But there's an inevitability to cataclysm that encompasses not only California, but the entire world and each and every one of us. So let's live our lives and have a good time. And with that spirit in mind, I was languishing by the pool earlier today. And I got a call from my friend Ronnie in Chicago. And Ronnie and I go back to the 90s, back in the wild, wild days of the time when I was a bar employee. I started as a bar back at the tender age of 32, I think, hauling ice from the basement of a nightclub. That, again, is a subject for another podcast, probably several. I worked my way through the ranks, as it were, to bartender and then bar manager. And Ronnie was a part of that scene. And to me, she was always the Jiminy Cricket of that zany circus like atmosphere, always telling it like it is. And she told me like it is earlier today as I sat in the sun in California. Fast forward 20, 30, pretty much 30 years. She's changed, I've changed, both of us haven't changed at all. But she did remark, almost in passing, that I'd done good. That vis-a-vis my kids, who are doing well, that I've been a good dad. Not exactly father of the year on cover of Time magazine. She joked that I couldn't even wipe my ass with the magazine, let alone be on the cover. That's Ronnie's humor, and she's probably right. But given all that, she gave me creds, and I'd give myself creds too for being a decent dad. A fun dad, maybe too much of a fun dad, erring on the side of that. In a sense, in opposition to my unfun dad, which will be the topic of this podcast. Tell a few stories here. But she made a remark that really resonated. She said that I became the kind of father that I always wanted to have. And that really stuck with me. She said, Mook, you became the dad that you wish you had. And that really, really resonated to the point where later in the day I had to grab the mic and share a few words about the dad that I had. It's made me ostensibly the dad that I've become. And I've written a lot about this. I blog on Medium, the blogger platform, under Mookie Spitz, profile name chosen completely at random, of course, but you can look me up under Mookie Spitz if you're curious, and I'll put some links in the podcast description. But one of these is what I call the Snoopy astronaut crash landing. And I reread that, and it resonated as well. It was kind of written with that same feeling. Ronnie captured it much better than I did, which is the great part of having a great friend that can kind of encapsulate some of your complicated feelings. And even if you're a writer or you're an artist, you can write a song or a blog post or a novel for that matter. And all it takes is a good friend to encapsulate the sentiment in a sentence or two. And then you go, wow, wish I could have said that. But then you might not write that blog or that novel or that song. So there you have it. Anyway, this blog was focused on how childhood defense mechanisms define our adult lives and how our adult lives in turn influence how we act toward the people, especially the people that we love. And in this sense, my own kids. So all of us have that pivotal childhood moment, an incident of acute crisis when under extreme duress, we reacted in a way that saved us from emotional annihilation. It's that winning strategy that's hardwired into our minds and our bodies, one that's used for the rest of our lives as an effective survival technique. I remember my defining incident and draw on its lessons to this day, especially when I think about my role as being that father. And once again, maybe not Time Magazine Dad of the Year, but I feel like I did my duty, and it was a duty of joy, not through obligation and not even thinking of it in terms of any sacrifice, but just in the joy of giving, and that's really what drives me forward with my relationship with my kids to this day, and puts a smile on my face as I reminisce, even if some of these stories are fairly maudlin and even painful. So back around 1970, 71, I was 6, maybe 7 years old. The Apollo moon missions were central to the American zeitgeist at the time. It really defined the country. And I'm staring through the glass of a gift shop display at a foot tall Snoopy doll that's wearing an astronaut's uniform. It's plastic. I'll include a link to it in the descriptions as well. But it was a Snoopy astronaut decked out in a uniform, big moon boots, big plastic helmet, and it came in a nice, colorful blue and red and black box. Snoopy astronaut. Kind of incongruous. You wouldn't think Snoopy's an astronaut. He did have the Sopwith Camel, of course. He was airborne, which was his house in his imagination, and sleeping on the top of his doghouse. I always thought he'd hurt himself at the crossover point, the tip of the triangles of the slanted roof of his doghouse. So maybe it wasn't too much of an extrapolation to have Snoopy in space as well, and it didn't seem to create too much cognitive dissonance, and it did quite the opposite for me when I was a kid looking at that doll through that gift shop glass. My father, his name was Laszlo, and we were waiting in a Southern California hospital to hear about my mother, Marianne, and she was recently admitted to this hospital following a nervous breakdown. Now, even the term nervous breakdown, that kind of seems antiquated, doesn't it? Someone has a nervous breakdown. I never, even back in the day, quite understood the combination of those two words, nervous and breakdown. Like, is it a breakdown of your nervous system? I guess that's what it is, what it was implying. And was the breakdown nervous? How can you have a nervous breakdown? You can have a breakdown of your nerves, but were they ever built up? I always thought that term nervous breakdown didn't make any sense. And we still use the term to imply what? Someone freaking out, someone just not being able to hack it anymore. Various comedy shows would focus on the nervous breakdown. Marty Feldman back in the day would have a nervous breakdown. Mel Brooks had a whole movie that revolved around the nervous breakdown. Remember High Anxiety? But still, it made little sense to me, and it made even less sense to me as a 6 or 7 year old. We were visiting my father's Hungarian boyhood buddy. My father's a Hungarian emigre, is born in Budapest. And he kept in touch with some of his childhood friends, the few in Hungary, they were Jews, who survived the ravages of the Holocaust that tore through Hungary late in the war following the Germans rolling into Hungary around 1944. The last year of the war, that was it. Turned everyone's life upside down, but not too many of them made it. But a handful of my father's high school Jewish friends made it. And I was born and I grew up in Chicago. And one of these friends of my father's, going all the way back to Budapest, Hungary, prior to the war, he survived too. He was a prankster in the group. His nickname was Mayom, or Monkey. He was Monkey. My father was Tiffy. There was another one, George or Yuri. And all of them had nicknames. And this guy's name was the Monkey. Both our families, my father and Mayom's family, I remember his wife, and there was a teenage daughter, a blonde a blonde young lady who, even at that young age, I thought she was kind of hot. And she was fairly friendly to me, if just a little bit aloof. Anyway, both of our families were touristing the Sunset Strip in California. And I remember the 70s look with the classic cars and the ice cream shops, the bell bottom jeans. I could feel, in my memories, I feel the late 60s, early 70s atmosphere of LA at the time. And Mayom actually just randomly purchased a 2-3 bedroom home in this shitty little suburb. It was Beverly Hills, California, right after the war. My father's friend George emigrated to Chicago. That's why my father ended up there, as did I, being born there. And Mayom ended up in California almost randomly, and just as randomly bought a house in Beverly Hills. Who knew? Anyway, both families were meeting and hanging out. The men were partying and reminiscing. And we were on the strip, and my mom just started freaking out. She was claiming that she was thirsty and that we needed to stop, and we had to stop right away. I remember this course of events vividly, like they were yesterday, but I don't remember it as a continuous film clip. I remember scenes, bits and pieces, but each piece is vivid, like it happened yesterday, or almost like I dreamt it this morning just before waking up. And the first thing I remember is we're in the car and she keeps repeating that she's thirsty and that we got to stop, and she's thirsty and we got to stop. And my father's telling her that we're not where we're trying to get to yet, but we got to stop. And the quickest stop we can make was into this taco joint. And there the next scene unfolds, as vivid as a dream I dreamt this morning. It had the tessellating tile and the gaudy reds and fuchsias and earth tone mixed colors in the tiling and the counter. It had the big sombreros hung up on the walls. And Mexican food was not really well known in Chicago at the time. And of course in California, with its Spanish heritage, Mexican immigration from Tijuana and through Baja. So even that place was new. It was different. I remember the smells and the energy. So anyway, we get her in there, and after she gets some water, they give her some water. She starts pacing frantically back and forth, repeating, "I need professional help," in English. My mother didn't speak much English. I mean, in public, she did when she had to. And I guess she felt she had to. So, in her heavy Hungarian accent, she was born in the Hungarian part of Romania, in Transylvania, actually. So, I always had those vampire jokes. But my Transylvanian, Romanian born Hungarian mother, who spoke Hungarian all the time at home to me, is in public and she's freaking out and she is screaming, saying, I need professional help. I need professional help. And she sounded like a hysterical Zsa Zsa Gabor, that same kind of accent. Zsa Zsa, of course, also Hungarian. I need professional help. I need professional help. And I remember the look on the young cashier's face, trying to assure us, but mostly herself, that she just called for help. Everything would be okay. And I remember the big square cash register, the old school non-digital cash register. I remember the landline phone with the big receiver, the big plastic receiver that wrapped halfway around your head, and then the concave receptacle of the phone on the side of the wall by the register, and the long cord, the wrapping thick plastic cord from the receiver to the wall unit, and her holding the phone pressed between her head and her shoulder, with her head tilted to the side, trying to help a customer while nodding that she had placed the call to get my mother help. And Marion, meanwhile, continued to frantically pace, vividly hysterical, repeating in a crazed, endless mantra, I need professional help. I need professional help. I was ashamed, and at the same time, I felt somehow responsible for everything that had happened. Shame and guilt flipped to fear and excitement within a few minutes when uniformed LAPD officers swarmed in. And I remember these guys too. They were tall and intimidating, then assuring and cool, reminding me of officers Pete and Jim from my favorite TV show, Adam 12. I was a big TV kid. I was glued to the set every night. Adam 12 was one of my favorite TV shows. Remember the black and white car, and then the stern looking officers and the banter and the hippies they used to arrest. Praising the scene, even the cops, these two cops, my own Pete and Jim, shrugged. Like, WTF? What the F is wrong with this woman? Because my mom couldn't stop repeating that she needed professional help. She needed professional help. I remember Pete or Jim or Pete saying to her, "It's all right, ma'am. We're gonna call an ambulance." And I remember him turning to his partner saying, "Can you call an ambulance for this crazy lady?" And they didn't know what to do, and I certainly didn't know what to do. The poor young lady at the cash register, still holding the phone, just kind of gaping at this crazy scene. The customers kind of scattering. My mom needed professional help. Well, she got it when the paramedics finally arrived a few minutes after that, freaking me out when they took her away in an ambulance. No one really told me what was going on. Mom was freaking out. These cool cops show up. Then the ambulance shows up. And I believe they wheeled her out in a wheelchair. They like set her down in a wheelchair and then they wheeled her out of this restaurant. Part of me was terrified I would never see her again. I mean, this was an institutional intervention. It was TV come to life. The fourth wall of that TV screen dissolved, and out popped Pete and Jim. Out popped the EMS unit for real. It was like I was on a set. But part of this turned into a horror show when they took my mom away. But there was another part of me, another part of that terrified little kid, that perhaps for that same reason, I felt relief that they had taken her away. My whole life, she obsessively worried about me or completely ignored me. Mom, for me, was a toxic mix of asphyxiating love and withdrawn abandonment. She was either on, like I was the focus of her attention, her manic attention, which came across in the form of nagging and pestering, eat more, dress more warmly, do this, do that. This sense of worry and terror and concern that she projected on me and everything that I did. And that was in stark contrast to her withdrawn, dazed, almost zombie like abandonment. And there was no balance between the two. There wasn't like a calm mood or conversation. There was no banter between us, no relaxed, just quotidian of living. It was either this asphyxiating love or this withdrawn abandonment, 0 or 1, and the 0 or 1 both vanished. The data that was mom suddenly got deleted. The hospital waiting room was next to the gift shop, full of cards and flowers for ailing adults, toys for sick children. There's something really, really depressing about gift shops, isn't there? Gift shops everywhere are kind of depressing, even in airports. You know, you're coming and going, and then there's all these knickknacks and bullshit, chocolates, flowers, and you know it's just kind of perfunctory purchases that people are making, last minute, convenient, overpriced, just to fulfill some kind of obligation. And the raw convenience begs the question of the sheer utility and opportunism of just buying something for people because you kind of have to. It's ritualized consumerism. And even then, I kind of felt it. But what I really wanted was that Snoopy astronaut. Snoopy stood defiantly on a glass shelf, like I mentioned. It was just above my head. And I gaped up at it with wonder. The black and white spacesuit adorned with the American flag, just like the real astronauts, but also like an inverse version of the cool cops I had seen. They had American flags on. They were black, they were dressed in black, getting out of a black and white. And at the time, all I wanted was for that astronaut Snoopy in his own black and white uniform to save me from this terrifying situation. I wanted to lose myself in that comic book, in that cartoon distraction. Now, if mother smothered me with nervous nagging or neglected me with manic self-absorption, then my father provided the perfect complement of deafening silence that was punctuated by torrents of screaming abuse. That didn't leave much room for conversation. As I pointed out, there wasn't much talking in my household. It's kind of hard to imagine, and whenever I relate this reality of growing up with my mother and father to friends, a few trusted colleagues or lovers, they all kind of look at me like I'm just exaggerating my misfortune. But it's very, very true. And I bring it up now, wrench any sorrow from anyone listening, but just to highlight the point that I grew up in this toxic atmosphere of screams or silence, of nagging or dismissal. So when I asked my dad a dozen times, and I remember asking him over and over if I could have it, let me buy that totemic cartoon character for me, Dad. He impatiently shook his head. I so wanted that Snoopy. I wanted that Snoopy to, in a sense, break the silence. And instead of a scream, I wanted that cute dog, Charlie Brown's cute dog, to maybe take me up in the Sopwith Camel. Or better yet, look at that. He's an astronaut. Maybe he could take me to the moon. Please, I groveled. I'm fixated on Snoopy Astronaut. Doll will comfort me. Its uniform already assuring me that spirit of exploration that's going to set me free. My father finally acquiesced, probably just shut me up already. My heart raced as I watched the store clerk unlock the case and remove the toy. I remember to this day, that's again one of those laser sharp little vignettes cut from the tape, episodic, but each of these little slivers scintillating in my mind to this day. Want it gift wrapped? The woman said at the store. No, I nodded dreamily and excitedly. My arms were shaking. At long last, I could have it. And then my father paid, and then she handed it right to me. And I couldn't believe it. I grabbed the doll, felt the material of the cloth of its suit. But the next thing I knew, Snoopy is plummeting to the floor in slow motion. The thrill of finally possessing it was overwhelming. My hands lost their grip. And before I knew anything, just like any accident as it happens, so immediately, so suddenly, so unexpectedly, I heard a snap, shattered my heart, and it raised the ire of my father, who knew what happened. He picked up the figure from the floor, turned it over, and he pointed at the crack in its helmet. And he stared into my being with his razor-sharp contempt and derision. Look at what you did, he grumbled in Hungarian. I got this for you, and this is what you do. I got it for you. I am giving you this, and you throw it right back in my face by breaking it the second that you hold it in your hand. And I remember him pulling apart the helmet to highlight the crack where it was broken, as if he's analyzing the damage done. And I could feel his derision of me breaking that toy. He had worked, he had money, he paid that money even though he didn't want to because I was a brat and I wouldn't stop begging for it. I finally get it, and I rub it in his face by breaking it. And that was just par for the course. I broke everything and my father fixed it. That encapsulated our relationship from busted toys to his whole life, which nosedived after I was born when his wife, my mom, fell into a horrible postpartum depression she nor the family ever escaped from. She was institutionalized frequently at this point, and she received every kind of treatment that they could give her, from electroshock therapy the psychoactive meds. There's an apocryphal story in the family that at one point she was institutionalized. Maybe during this incident, I'm not quite sure, but she was in the same room with Squeaky Fromm of the Manson family. I heard this, I believe, from her almost jokingly, and I think my sister told me at some point. But my mom was in a room in one of these hospitals with Squeaky Fromm, and Squeaky, who was apparently a caricature artist, drew a caricature of my mom and gave it to her. So I don't know what happened with that caricature of my mother drawn by Squeaky Fromm of the Manson family and Presidential Assassination Club. But there you have it. I am 1 degree from Squeaky, if that is true. And imagine what that would fetch on eBay if it could be found and if I would be willing to give it up. But going back to the Snoopy incident, that was typical of my rapport with my father. I would break things, he would fix it. I would do something bad, he would be disappointed. But given how mother just publicly lost her mind, I was particularly raw at this moment, more so than I could even imagine at the time. And this moment proved to be a defining and transformative one, which is why I remember it now, and why I'm taking this Sunday night and talking about it. My parents never showed their love, and that was totally my fault, of course. Mother was crazy, father was an asshole. Why? Because I was a bad boy. Proof being that I stood helpless as mom lost it in that West Hollywood taco joint. She lost it until they took her away, and that was a feeling that repeated as I stood helpless after Dad bought me the best toy in the world and I wrecked it. I kept blowing the shot. It was my fault that mom was thirsty. It was my fault that she needed professional help. And it was my fault that she had to get taken away. It was my fault that Snoopy broke. And my emotional annihilation was looming. At this point, I had nowhere else left to go. So I remember that he put the broken Snoopy back into the box. And for some reason, I remember him trying to fix it. Maybe he bought some tape or some glue. And I remember after this instance, him going through the motions of trying to glue it back together and put it back in the box and instructing me not to touch it because, of course, I would break it again. And then we wandered into the hospital, presumably to go visit my mother, who was put there, who knows, maybe with Squeaky in one of those rooms deep in that dark building. But what happened, and again, the scene cuts to another sliver of tape that didn't make it to the editing room floor, that stayed in the film of my memories. I wandered away from disappointed Dad into the labyrinthian hospital. I don't know what became of me, but I literally just started walking. Initially, I had no purpose, you know, and then ostensibly, I wanted to find my manic depressive mom. I wander away, and then I think I'll go look for mom. But then as I got lost, I realized the further away I got from both of them. The further away I got from my father, who I left behind, and when I gave up on actually looking for my mom, the further away I got from my mom, too. The further away I got from both of my parents, the more lost I became, the more liberated I felt. And then in that moment, for the first time, I learned the power of escape. I gained the resilience of relying on nobody, especially those who asphyxiated me with their judgment and their anxiety. That was my first moment of really being free. Decades later, I still wandered randomly and purposelessly through the maze of adulthood. That metaphor, that moment carried its way through. In Antitheseus, refusing to fight the Minotaur or accept Ariadne's help, I indulged that old Greek story of being lost in the maze, fighting the monster. And I gradually realized that the monsters and lovers I fled from were the roaring beasts inside my own head and heart. Living alone, as I chose to do for years into young adulthood, I was forever invulnerable. Attempting nothing, I never failed. A vivid imagination and penchant for reckless rationalization filled my void. An obsession with creative fantasy and unattainable perfection protected me from the banal reality of everyday life and, frankly, from hard work. Whenever the going got tough, I got going. Astronaut Snoopy, back in that hospital, we went to go visit my mom after her nervous breakdown, had crashed and burned. But off into young adulthood, years and years later, I had survived a catastrophic accident by emulating what I did moments after Snoopy took a dive. I did that by running away and never returning, never going back home. And that was exemplified by rejecting family and rejecting career. Everyone around me, late into high school, into college, they leaped into life, into some kind of trajectory, checking boxes, doing what they had to do. But I was always the iconoclast. I was always the misanthrope. I was always the one who wanted to stay detached. I wanted to fly with Snoopy and his Sopwith. I wanted to head toward the moon with that Snoopy astronaut. I wanted to get lost in that dark, humid, mildewy smelling hospital. And I wanted to get lost away from my parents and at the same time away from any kind of accountability and responsibility. Some point in that labyrinth of life, in that mildewy maze of a mental hospital that became my own young adulthood, I don't remember becoming disappointed in Disappointed Dad per se. The shift likely happened gradually, but when it did, I jettisoned with him all my natural impulses against criticism and judgment. The result made personal excellence impossible. My ridiculously high standards were self-created, and lacking an external benchmark, I became my own worst critic. Unable and then unwilling to please him, judgment, rebuke, nothing was ever good enough for Laszlo. I refused to satisfy anyone else either. Negativity became an effective shield. Nothing ever good enough, especially if I did it. We all have our strengths, the brightest lights leaving the longest shadows, as Carl Jung wrote, making imperfection inevitable and even desirable. But I left no room for that and awkwardly hid behind it. In everything I did and appraised, I ended up mirroring my father's critical qualities, the painful irony making me even angrier, and then crowding my teen years and beyond with paradox. I became a young intellectual who hated school, a born storyteller who shunned the limelight, and a sentimental romantic terrified of ever getting laid. My father's penetrating stare and savage rebuke kept Snoopy Astronaut permanently grounded. You'll find dynamics like these in Holocaust survivor families, especially between refugee fathers and their spoiled, rotten sons. I've met several first generation Holocaust kids with stories eerily similar to mine, their dads struggling through hell to get their children into heaven, and once there, reminding them in every way they could of exactly what that generation endured. The abused grown son either accepts or rejects, converges or diverges with the father's personality and profession. I saw this happen over and over again. It was more than just a random pattern. And there have been books, articles, I think some documentaries about this phenomena too. And I lived it, and I knew many, many other of my peers who did too. For example, I knew one kid who emulated his father's corporate executive personality directly and absolutely right into the nepotistic boardroom. They became clones of each other, cross generational clones. Another tried to outdo his father at his same game, but ended up crashing and burning. While I, as you've likely noticed by now, went full anti disappointment dad. I ended up just rejecting him outright. And I did that by self destructing in my own way. If my father grabbed a book out of my hand that I wanted to buy after flipping through it and seeing some math equations and deciding that it was too hard for me, or if my father came into my room and scoffed at all of the used books that I had purchased that I was reading, screaming at me that I was wasting my time and money with these dusty, shitty books, if my father became the opposite of the empowering, emboldening, supportive father, then I in turn would fulfill his wrath by becoming the loser son that he always knew I was and would become. If he precluded me being successful with his abuse, then fuck you. I would go for it and become everything he did and didn't want me to be. I would punish him by punishing myself. And it was an easy path to take because it was the path of really least resistance. I wouldn't have to try really hard to give up. I could just give up. And deep down inside, I knew that nothing would disappoint him more than for his wrath to have the impact that he wanted it to. That sentiment crescendoed into estrangement around my 25th birthday when mom, his wife, institutionalized, chronically depressed, over medicated, borderline catatonic, finally committed suicide by overdosing on her psychoactive meds. Despite receiving the professional help she kept asking for, her demise was a slow burn of depression, agoraphobia, and who knows what else. Think Leo's mom from What's Eating Gilbert Grape. minus the chain smoking and grotesque obesity. My mother was the exact same type. A woman who had completely given up on life, who did the bare minimal, if that, and who projected, whether willfully or not, all of her depression, anxiety onto her only son. That's all that I knew. That's all that I had growing up. Indeed, mother was crazy and father was an asshole. Now that I could handle, even if it was all my fault. I could deal with that shit. That's what I had known. That became central to my identity. That's who I was. But mother killing herself was a devastating burden too heavy to bear. A week before her suicide, I called my father Laszlo at work, demanding an intervention. He snapped right back that I was disturbing him, that Marianne, my mom, his wife, was always this way. I should get over it and God damn it, stop bothering him. How many times has he told me never, ever to call him at work unless there was an emergency? Well, God damn it, it was an emergency. And that just made him even more furious. She's always been like this, he shouted, and I could tell he was embarrassed. This was the pre-cell phone days. He was on a landline. He was a foreman in a factory, and he was probably in an open space. And he wanted to scream. He wanted to unload like he normally did, but he couldn't. So he had to kind of hush, a hushed whisper of a raging hysterical response. She's always been this way. Once again, it was my fault. I was too stupid and too ignorant to acknowledge the obvious. Once again, I was inconveniencing him. Once again, I was given the toy that I had begged for and I fucking broke it. It was my fault. Snoopy was broken. A week later, she was dead. That was the proverbial last straw, the long overdue excuse I needed to resolutely and finally walk away from that gift shop and wander throughout that hospital forever. Enough was enough. With that 1-2 punch of death and estrangement, I lost both parents in one fell swoop. It's like I turned a fast corner in that mental institution and I made them both go away. Finally, 20 years later, I was able to pull this off. And what I thought was a soul destroying combo of judgment and anxiety that had crushed my youth would also go with that. One quick turn, no one would know any better, and I could finally be free. We all have choices in our lives. Become a card sharp, a marathon runner, a day trader, a jet pilot, or a homeless vagabond. How we end up doing what we do and the way we do it has always been mysterious to me. Talent is a mixture of aptitude, attitude, and appetite. But which forces do we control and which control us? If we can dream anything we want, then why do we have nightmares? I've always wondered why we do what we do. All of us have these hopes and dreams. minutes of every day going into hours, hours into whole days, days into weeks and months. How much time do we spend brooding and thinking and processing our lives, planning, overthinking the thoughts into which feelings force us into new thoughts and feelings, when all we need to do is just to do something? And then we end up doing something, and then we ask, why did we do just what we did? And then how much of it is conscious? How much of it did we plan? How much of it is a consequence of our thinking, of our feeling? And how much of it just fucking happens? I had good reasons to hate my parents, as most kids do. And, this sounds, even relating it now, it sounds like it really sucks. It really did suck. It was bad. But compared to what? A Syrian refugee, someone born in sub-Saharan Africa, or any of the stories that I heard from friends, from trusted colleagues and peers. Everyone's got these skeletons in their closet. It's really just a matter of being honest with oneself, sitting down on a Sunday evening after a friend calls, getting inspired by something. Sit down, open up, be honest with yourself. What kind of horrors are there behind one's own life? Stuff that doesn't get shared, maybe should be shared. And if it's shared, shared with impunity and a willingness to at least express oneself and just let it all out. Some feelings are justified, others banal expressions of our own failings. But way back then, eventually, I came to the unavoidable realization that none of that stuff mattered. Nobody ever said life is fair or we're born surrounded by cool people. Adulthood is defined as the stubborn embrace of personal responsibility and hard work. It's growing up. We don't pick our parents. Maybe we don't pick anybody, including and especially ourselves. Imagine randomly stumbling into a sports stadium full of people, and then the first person that you bump into becomes your father or your mother. Most people we don't get along with in this life. And you could say that there's something to be said for genetics, kind of a genotypical continuity or commonality, like we share base pairs of DNA and protein coding, and therefore what? We should get along better? Look at a litter of kittens. You got the calico kitten and the tabby and the black one with white mittens and the white one with black mittens, all from the same mom and dad, all struggling to get at the nip. What do they have in common? None of this really makes any sense. And nobody said it would be a free ride or easy. And who's really paying attention or keeping track anyway? The night of her burial, my mom's burial, she appeared to me in a dream. And this I remember more vividly than anything I've related so far. My bedroom in which I was sleeping, as I slept, as I dreamt, sleeping in a bedroom, was a stone crypt lit by flaming sconces adorned with iron and bronze. I was drawn to a side chamber. I was sleeping, but then I was standing, and I was standing, and then I was walking. And I was walking in that side chamber where she was standing. My mother was standing in her white shawl, the white burial shawl. that Jews bury their dead. They don't preserve the body, they don't even cosmetically adorn the body, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. I like the ritual of the Jewish tradition. There's many aspects of Judaism that I find frankly absurd. My father forced me into years of Hebrew school, so I'm privy to some of the traditions. I could read Hebrew, at least phonetically, if not understand a word of it. I know a bunch of the rituals. I self identify as Jewish in the sense of talking with my hands and liking theater. But anyway, in this dream, almost like a muscle memory or an ancestral memory, she stood standing in her white burial shawl, and it's a plain white shawl meant to rot with the body, rot with the plain pine cast, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We want our dead to go back into the earth from which we come. It's not about preserving the dead. It's not about preserving them for the afterlife. In Judaism, the afterlife is sketchy. There is no heaven and hell in Judaism. That's weird, isn't it? So many other religions, it's all about getting to heaven. It's all about avoiding hell. And for some reasons, the Jews hardly ever talk about the afterlife. And they don't seem to have that much of a problem with this either for another time. Anyway, she was standing there in her white burial shawl in this crypt with the flaming sconces scattering torchlight, shadows bouncing, and she was adjusting her mangled hair. In the flickering light, she was appraising herself in a warped mirror. And she asked me in Hungarian, "How do I look?" I told her she looked great. She seemed to have her doubts, so I assured her again. She nodded, smiled self-consciously, her attention drawn away. She was trying to look her best before entering to the other side. The candle flames suddenly shot up, just like in the movies. And as they burst forward, they were suddenly extinguished. And with them, my burden of absorbing her anxiety and depression throughout my childhood. Calm and support she couldn't share in her life, she at long last gave me in her death. As that crypt went suddenly dark, I felt the burden of all of her anxiety and depression literally leave from my body. Light to dark, happiness to sadness, we oscillate between boundaries of birth and death. My refugee parents survived the war, but not each other. Our family, as I've described, pretty much a nightmare. And it was a nightmare in the country of their dreams, the American dream. Everything was supposed to be great. They always wanted to come to the States. They independently emigrated from my father from Budapest, as I mentioned, my mother from the Hungarian part of Romania. They emigrated independently to Caracas, Venezuela. My mother was already married, already had my sister, my half sister, and that didn't work out. Then my divorced mother met my single father, and they married. They had me, and then 8 months or so pregnant, they finally made it to the States, the land of their dreams. Consider me an anchor baby. They were both fleeing the anguish of the worlds they ran from, the world in Europe that had nearly destroyed them. And ironically enough, they fled the chaos of South America in turmoil. The dictator Perez Jimenez in Venezuela succumbing to progressively more destabilizing governments. My father always wanting to be an American. My mother, in a sense, going along for the ride. And then everything went to hell. I left a stone on my mother's grave and didn't speak to my father for a decade after her funeral. One day I called him up and we spoke like nothing happened. We did not talk for years. And when his birthday came around for the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, the sixth time, and I filled myself up with hatred. He was complicit. A week before her death, he did nothing. I tried to save her. He didn't bother. He didn't care. One birthday, two birthdays, three birthdays. My hatred did nothing to expiate my own sense of guilt, my own regret. And I knew that reconciliation would be the only way that I could really overcome my own dependency on hating him, as if that was the only vestige of peace that I could find with this tumultuous family situation. Fast forward a decade after that, after we were more or less back in touch, Laszlo would be mercifully euthanized in a hospice, his morphine drip set to a fire hose level. I'd played out his deathbed scenario 100 times over all these agonizing years, variations ranging from kicking his ass to not showing up at all. But when the time came, I was there, sitting near him and whispering. Maybe he heard what I was saying, his mouth twitching in the hospice, dying, me coming to say goodbye. The courtesy I could only give my mother in a dream, telling her that she looked great before entering the other world, I gave my father on his deathbed. I assured Laszlo that everything was all right, said that his life was meaningful, and he should be proud after everything that happened in his long life between the two of us. He certainly didn't need my validation, but after enduring our broken relationship and agony of estrangement, I knew it hurt him. Of course it hurt him. He deserved to hear it. He deserved to hear that everything was okay, that he had a grandchild who was healthy, that he had another one on the way. My younger son, only 2 months away from being born. I assured him that the Snoopy astronaut had finally found his wings. And in that moment, I knew that I had finally gotten free. I realized that it wasn't about running through that hospital, but it was to a certain extent about going back and showing thanks, showing gratitude. Gratitude is something that children have so much trouble ever even really feeling that they owe. And I understood in that moment when I released myself and I released him that I didn't forgive and I certainly didn't forget, but moving on was only possible through showing that gratitude and expressing that kind of kindness. And this entire scene came up vividly in my mind the second Ronnie told me about how I became the father that I wish I had. Because I had my own trials and tribulations with my own family, just like all families do. And if I erred on the side of any excess or any extreme or anything that I could have or would have or should have done differently, then it might have been becoming the anti Laszlo rather than be brooding and silent, only to explode in screams and abuse and derision. I definitely became that fun dad, the let's order a pizza dad, that go ahead and video game all you want dad. I became the smiling dad, the doting dad, the buy them all the presents they ask for spoiling dad, the lack of a disciplinarian dad, the let the kids run loose and perform mayhem kind of dad. The dad who gave my kids enough slack to whiplash right back into my own face in the form of taking me for granted kind of dad. I see it all the time where parents can be abusive. Parents have addiction problems. Parents are more needy and less mature than their own children. And I used to wonder as a child how parents could be this way. And I would see their children respond to these abusive, addicted, difficult parents with deference, with obsessive respect. They would walk carefully and chew with their mouth closed for fear of upsetting these overly sensitive, dependent parents. And looking back, it makes a little bit of sense because there might be parts of me now that feel as though I've been taken for granted being such a fun dad, being such a gleeful, giving, spoiling dad. And maybe there's some twisted logic to being a difficult parent because you create a dependency based on that obsessiveness, maybe even based on that abuse, maybe even based to a certain extent on one's own helplessness. Because if the parent is suffering and the parent is unpredictable, then the child needs to be responsive. You have them. They can't take you for granted because you don't let them. Nice guys finish last, and nice parents get taken for granted. But if you ask me, that's a price that's worth paying. And if I didn't get on the cover of Time magazine as Dad of the Year, then I definitely don't deserve it, because finding a balance between freedom and discipline, between structure and openness, is the art of good parenting. And if Laszlo and Marianne erred on the side of silence or abuse, brooding or nagging, neglect or obsession, then I similarly erred on the side of being smiley and Pollyanna and just ordering a pizza whenever the going got rough. But you know what? I'll take it. I'll agree with Ronnie that it's been a long, strange, exciting ride. 20 years put into 3 kids, no regrets, endless joyful memories, and ones through which I could look at the lens of my own dysfunctional childhood and celebrate a destruction, a breaking of the chain, hopefully, of cross generational trauma and a tradition of passing from generation to generation the anxiety of a history of a people chosen to endure. Rather than endure, let's just live and thrive. And what a hell of a ride it has been. So thank you for listening. And maybe you could relate to yourself as a parent or just as a human, as a son or daughter, enduring history, enduring our own parents, and hopefully having the opportunity to not repeat the patterns and create something new, even and especially if it's imperfect. Thanks for listening to the No Hair, All Heart podcast. And I'm your host, Wookie Spitz, with more ruminations to come.